These videos simply provide a presentation in video format of the book, Predator at the Chessboard by Ward Farnworth. The book is freely available online at http://www.chesstactics.org. White to move. What is the best move? Some of the familiar elements from this chapter are in place this time and some aren't. The queens aren't aimed at each other, nor does Black's king protect his queen. On the other hand, White has a rook aimed at d8 and a battery of bishop and queen trained on f7. Those latter elements do not necessarily suggest the precise idea we have been considering, but they do suggest the importance of looking at checks and especially the bishop takes at f7, check. Sacrifice. Once White plays that move, notice how few choices Black has in reply. He can't move the king because all of its flight squares are attacked. He's required to play queen takes bishop. Examine the aftermath of this simple exchange and see how it has changed matters. Now the two queens attack each other, and Black's queen is protected by his king, so naturally we resort next to a check to prize the king away from the queen. This time White returns to his rook for the purpose, playing the flush check. Rook moves to d8, check. And requiring Black's king to take his rook, a decoy. Now the queen is loose, and White plays queen takes queen. Again we see how any sequence that brings the enemy king and queen into a dependent relationship by forcing the enemy queen to interpose, by forcing either piece to make a capture and move next to the other, etc., creates a potential vulnerability. White to move. What is the best move? Driving off the queen with a threat. The idea of the flush attack that we've been examining, moves where you stick an attacker right next to the enemy king to make it move, can be used against other pieces as well, such as the queen. This section looks at some examples. In the frame to the left, White's bishop and queen attack Black's knight on f6, but the knight is defended 3 times by Black by his bishop, his queen, and his other knight. White would need to remove 2 of those guards to win the contested knight. One of them already is under attack. White's rook can take the knight on d7. But notice that rook takes knight, a sacrifice of the exchange, not only captures one of the guards but is a flush attack against another, the queen. It may seem counterintuitive to plant the rook against a queen because it so obviously gets taken, but when Black does play queen takes rook, he now finds his knight on f6 overmatched, attacked twice and guarded once. White plays bishop takes knight next move, and has won 2 knights for a rook. The queen was decoyed away to d7. This position also could have been placed with studies in the previous chapter, where capturing one guard has the effect of removing 2 of them, The recapture you invite by your opponent draws one of his pieces out of position. Those cases likewise could have been described in part as decoys. The jargon doesn't matter. The important point is to see that there are different ways to get rid of pieces that guard a target you want to take. One is to capture them, another is to attack them and hope to provoke a capture, even with an obvious sacrifice. Sometimes, as here, both techniques can be used at once. White to move. What is the best move? You see that white's bishop attacks black's knight, and also that white's queen attacks the black rook on d5. Hopefully you also see that queen takes rook would put white's queen at the top of a triangle that would include black's other rook at one point and black's king and queen at the other, a provocative pattern. Now identify the obstacle to queen takes rook, the black queen, which protects his rook. With the impediment clearly seen, you can be systematic in getting rid of it. How can white force black's queen away from its defensive duties? With the decoy rook moves to e7, another flush attack. Black's queen has no place to go that is safe and that allows it to keep guarding the rook on d5. So black plays queen takes rook, and then comes the significance of the triangular pattern mentioned earlier. White plays queen takes rook, check. Which in itself only wins back the rook just sacrificed, but which also forks black's other rook and king, and wins the second rook after the king moves. Black to move. What is the best move? Black at present does not attack anything, but he sees the alignment of white's bishop and queen and sees as well that the queen is the bishop's only guard. Exploration of a skewer is indicated with 1. Bishop moves to d5, where black's bishop takes protection from its rook. The problem is that white can just move his queen over to g4, out of harm's way and yet still able to guard the bishop on f3. But now rethink the challenge as it then would appear. We still have white's bishop under attack, so we no longer are looking at a skewer so much as we are looking for a way to remove the bishop's guard the queen so that bishop takes bishop will become profitable for black. Be persistent in looking for resources you can use to attack the queen again. Remember your pawns, play 2. Pawn from h7 moves to h5. The queen must move, and this time it will have to venture to g5, out of reach of the bishop. Black takes it next move. Instead of pawn from h7 moves to h5, black could have chased off the queen with pawn from f7 moves to f5. Why not that move instead? Because you must be wary of pawn moves that open lines to your king. Moves of the f-pawns off the 7th rank are frequent examples. When you consider so moving a pawn, imagine ways your opponent could put a bishop or queen on that diagonal and give check. Here white would be able to reply bishop takes bishop, check. After black spends a move on rook takes bishop, the priority of check, that's the point, white would move his queen to safety, and the two sides would have done nothing but exchange bishops. Consider another variation. Suppose white replies to the pawn push pawn from h7 moves to h5 by moving his queen to f4. Black plays 3. Queen takes queen, 4. Pawn from e3 takes queen, bishop takes bishop and wins a piece. But now imagine white's rook starting on c3 instead of c1. Would it change your analysis? It should, for then after 4. Pawn from e3 takes queen, the bishop on f3 no longer is loose, a line has been cleared, causing the bishop to become guarded by white's rook. This variation would have saved the day for white and prevented the sequence from succeeding for black. It's worth playing this variation through in your mind's eye until it becomes clear, as the key point, the movement of the e3 pawn, and its unexpected consequences, is a bit subtle. Alright, if both sides see the original diagrammed position correctly, what really happens? Black starts with 1. Bishop moves to d5, and white replies right away with 2. Queen takes bishop, rook takes queen, 3. Bishop takes rook. In this way white gets back a rook and bishop for his queen, a better deal than losing a piece. But don't stop there, ask what happens next. White's bishop would be left loose on d5, so black looks right away for forks with his queen. 3. Queen moves to e5, attacks the bishop and the loose pawn on b2 at the same time. After white defends with rook moves to d1, black picks up the pawn to make the outing more worthwhile. This final result illustrates the role that tactics play in good chess. The really nifty sequence you see often doesn't get played out, because once it begins your opponent sees the rest of it coming and makes a lesser sacrifice to avoid worse trouble. Thus the most beautiful combinations may never get executed, but seeing them still is the key to winning, because the threats they create force sacrifices that still result in decisive gains. White to move. What is the best move? What does white attack? His knight is ready to take black's bishop, except that the bishop is protected by black's queen, though not by the pawn on g7, which of course is pinned. White can't take the queen, but perhaps an attack would drive it off and loosen the bishop. White can threaten it with bishop moves to e4. This may look scary because the bishop has none of the protection that we usually think necessary before a piece attacks a queen, but white has other advantages to compensate. His knight's threatened capture, knight takes bishop, check, is a check, so it has the potential to fork any enemy piece that finds its way onto the middle of the board, e4 or d5. In this case, if black replies to bishop moves to e4 with queen takes bishop, his queen gets forked and taken by knight takes bishop, check. So the bishop's attack at least is safe. And bishop moves to e4 has another virtue, it aims white's bishop at the black bishop on b7, which also is guarded only by black's queen, again, a pattern familiar from our work on skewers. If black moves his queen over to d6 so as to keep protecting the bishop on f6, the bishop on b7 is lost. Likewise, if black moves the queen to c7 so as to keep protecting the bishop on b7, the bishop on f6 is lost to knight takes bishop. You can see here that the attacked queen has an impressive ability to move and still defend its protectorate, but not quite impressive enough to allow it to move and still defend two protectorates. The queen, in short, is overworked. But for our purposes here, the point is just that an attack against a queen to drive it away from guard duty becomes a good deal more likely to work when the queen has more than one piece to protect, for then it will be hard for your opponent to find the queen another square where it is safe and still protects both of the vulnerable pieces. White to move. What is the best move? Consider any threats. White makes always a sound inquiry at the start of a position. His queen attacks black's rook. The rook is defended by black's queen. A mission appears, drive off the black queen. White has a bishop he can use for the purpose, he plays it to h3. In this case the queen has no place it can go that both is safe and allows it to keep protecting the rook on d8. It might seem that white therefore will win the rook easily, since after his one bishop moves to h3 the queen must move or be lost. But black does have one other option, he can play pawn from f7 moves to f6, interposing a pawn to block the path of white's queen to his rook, and also threatening to take white's queen with the pawn if white plays bishop takes queen. When confronted with one of these threats, if you take mine, I'll take yours, look at what each of you would be able to do on the board as it would appear after those captures have been made. What would you be able to attack once the pieces involved are on their new squares? In this case white imagines playing bishop takes queen and black replying pawn from f6 takes queen. He pictures his bishop on d7 and asks what he would play, and the answer is clear, bishop takes knight, picking up not the guarded knight on e8 but rather the now loose knight on a4. When a bishop, or any piece, makes a capture, ask if it has any forking prospects in its new position. This is yet another case where a queen protected two other pieces, creating eventual trouble for its owner. Black to move. What is the best move? First find the idea for black. You see that his rook attacks white's rook. More importantly, your search for loose pieces and checks turns up the potential queen fork. Queen takes at e4, check. Which would win a rook if the forking square were not protected by white's queen. Black could try to decoy the guard away with rook takes rook, but then white has a knight he can use to recapture without moving his queen. Don't let go of the goal of budging the queen, however. With a little more looking you can find another way to decoy it, bishop moves to b5. White would prefer not to play queen takes bishop, as it leaves e4 unattended and so allows black to win a rook with the aforementioned queen fork. Yet what else is there? he would like to find a safe square to which he could move the queen while still enabling it to guard e4. Such a square exists. He could play queen moves to b4, but then black plays bishop takes knight, followed by more losses for white since now his queen is the only remaining guard of the rook on c5 and the forking square e4. Now you can see the power of bishop moves to b5. It not only is an attack on the queen but also skewers the knight behind it, which becomes loose if the queen moves. That little two-piece diagonal cluster of white's queen and loose knight should provoke thoughts of a skewer from the outset. Put differently, this is another case where the queen is potentially overloaded, as it is the sole guardian of the knight on d3 and the forking square, and pawn on e4. Black doesn't have both points under attack at the beginning, but once white's queen is attacked, it has no square where it can continue to guard both points. We aren't quite finished. After black plays 1. Bishop moves to b5, white doesn't have to move his queen at all. There also is the option of unleashing a counter threat against black's queen. 2 knight moves to f2 has this effect. Now both queens are under attack. The problem is that when white moved his knight to f2, he left his rook on c5 guarded only by his queen. So black destroys the guard, by forcing an exchange of queens, with 2. Bishop takes queen, 3. Knight takes queen, rook takes rook, 4. Pawn from b3 takes bishop, rook takes at c4, taking a loose pawn, and black has won the exchange plus a pawn. Okay, but maybe white can avoid this problem by first liquidating the rooks, another variety of counterattack. After black's bishop moves to b5, in other words, white immediately plays 2. Rook takes rook, check. Rook takes rook and then 3. Knight moves to f2, threatening black's queen and doing it without any worries that his rook will end up being taken. This can lead to some hairy complications, as often is the case when a threat in one place is not met head-on but is countered with a fresh threat elsewhere, so for convenience the resulting position is diagrammed in the next frame. Black to move. What is the best move? It might appear that white has succeeded in avoiding the major threats that had troubled him, for now if queens are traded with 3. Bishop takes queen, 4. Knight takes queen, black has nothing too bad left to unleash. But this mistakenly assumes that black will take white's queen with his bishop. He can do better by playing 3. Rook takes queen, for now if white replies 4. Knight takes queen, black has a rook fork, rook takes at e4, check. Taking white's knight on the next move and winning a piece. That last bit is the most important thing to see here. It is the reason why this whole counter-offensive of white's, starting with 2. Rook takes rook, check. Doesn't work. But for the sake of completeness it should be said that in this last diagram black actually can do still better than rook takes queen. He can play his queen to d7. The resulting position looks innocuous, but in fact white is in serious trouble. This is the hairy part. The only safe square for white's queen is b4. But 4. Queen moves to b4 clears the way for black to play 4. Rook moves to c1, check. White's options suddenly are limited. If he moves his king to d2, he gets mated immediately with b-pawn from g7 moves to h6. White has no other flight squares for his king, so he has to interpose with 5. Knight moves to d1. Now that white has moved his knight, it is safe for black to move his queen back to g4. This leaves the bishop on b5 loose, so white can take it with his queen, 6. Queen takes bishop, but then black has queen takes knight, check. Forcing 7. King moves to f2, queen moves to e1, check. And various further troubles, e.g., 8. King moves to f3, rook moves to c3, check. 9. King moves to g2, not king moves to g4, to which black replies rook takes at g3, check. And mates soon, queen takes at e4, check. Check after check, 10. King moves to h3, queen takes rook and then eventually queen takes knight as well. You are excused from tracing out all these latter complications, but the rest of the position is worth close study. It has a bit of everything. White to move. What is the best move? Using the priority of check. As we have seen, one obstacle to driving off a queen with a threat is that a queen usually can capture anything that attacks it. In one common scenario, your opponent's queen is guarding one of his pieces, so you attack his queen with yours. Assuming that both queens have protection, how does he react? Not by moving his queen and leaving its protectorate loose, but rather by taking yours with queen takes queen. After you recapture his queen, the target the queen had been guarding, the piece you had been hoping to take after driving off the queen, simply moves, and your sequence is ruined. The underlying problem when this happens involves move order. When you threaten the enemy queen and it replies by capturing your attacker, you've lost the initiative, now you are responding to his moves. But sometimes this trouble can be avoided by use of the priority of check, the requirement that a pending check must be addressed before doing anything else. We've seen the principle from time to time in earlier sections. Here we consider one application in detail, cases where when the capture you want to make in the end, after you drive off the enemy queen, also will give check. For then when the enemy queen takes the piece you used to attack it, example your queen, you don't recapture, instead you take the target you originally hoped to capture. Since this gives check, your opponent has to pause to save his king, and then after this you still can go back and take his queen. All this will be clearer after some illustrations. Begin by taking the position on the left methodically. What does white attack? His bishop can take black's knight on h6, but it's guarded by black's queen. White can attack the queen with his bishop or rook, but however he tries to do this, the attacking piece gets taken. Rook moves to d1 leads to queen takes rook, check. For example, and anyway black could just move his queen to another square where it still protects his knight. The key point to see is that if white ever does play bishop takes knight, the result is a check of black's king. Of course black can just move his king out of it, but this will cost him a move. In a sense this means that after playing bishop takes knight white will get a free move, 2 captures in a row. How to take advantage of this? By starting with the attack queen moves to c7. Notice that this threatens black's loose bishop as well as his queen. Black thus cannot afford to just move his queen to a square like d6, as this loses a piece. So suppose he plays queen takes queen. Black might be expecting white to recapture rook takes queen, an exchange of queens that still gives black time to save his knight. But now the priority of check takes its bite. Instead of rook takes queen, white plays the capture bishop takes knight, check. Black has to move his king. Then white plays rook takes queen, recovering the queen and gaining a piece with the sequence. Observe the elements of the pattern: a target guarded by its queen, a potential capture of the target that also will give check, a way for your queen to attack the defending queen with protection, and another threat your queen can make along the way, this time to black's loose bishop, that requires your opponent to play queen takes queen rather than move his queen to some other square from which it can protect the piece you are trying to take. Not all of these elements must be present in every case, but each of them does important work here. With those basics out of the way, let's also consider a couple of loose ends. After 1. Queen moves to c7, queen takes queen, white doesn't have to play 2. Bishop takes knight in order to win a piece. If he plays rook takes queen right away, he now has attacks pending against 2 loose black pieces, the knight on h6 and the bishop on b7. Black only has time to move one of them, so white will be able to take the other. The danger of this approach is that black can try to save himself by making trouble with either of his threatened men. Since he isn't in check, he has much more freedom in replying to his predicament. Here he can play knight takes at g4, picking up a pawn to help compensate for his forthcoming loss of a piece. The main line sequence described earlier doesn't allow black this luxury. It also wins white an extra pawn at the end. 1 queen moves to c7, queen takes queen, 2 bishop takes knight, check. King moves to e8, 3. Rook takes queen, bishop moves to e4, saving the loose bishop, 4. Rook takes at a7. Black to move. What is the best move? Our current pattern seen from black's side. The elements differ only a little in their details. The first point, black has a capture he wants to make in rook takes rook. The second point, rook takes rook also would check white's king. The third point, white's rook is protected by his queen. The fourth point, black can attack white's queen with protection, and while also attacking a loose white piece, with queen moves to c6. White could just move his queen to e2 and still protect his rook on d1, but then he loses the rook on b5, which black has forked. It goes 1, queen moves to c6, 2. Queen moves to e2, rook takes rook, check. 3. Queen takes rook d1, queen takes rook b5. So in reply to 1. Queen moves to c6, suppose white plays 2. Queen takes queen. Now black does not recapture white's queen. He knows that if he first plays other moves with check, white's queen still will be there to take afterwards. Thus black plays 2. Rook takes rook, check. And after white moves his king, black has 3. Pawn from b7 takes queen, netting a rook. What if black instead bites after 2? Queen takes queen by playing 2. Pawn from b7 takes queen? Notice that now white is in a minor fix because both of his rooks are under attack. The pawn capture of black's queen just happened to create a threat against the rook on b5. This doesn't mean white has to lose anything, he simply plays 3. Rook takes rook, permitting black to play pawn from c6 takes rook, and now both sides have traded queens and rooks. The key point, however, is that if black does play 2. Pawn from b7 takes queen, giving white a move to use to save his rook on d1, white mustn't squander it by playing 3. Rook moves to f1. That's a superficially appealing move because now his rook has some protection, but in fact it's ruinous because white has forfeited the initiative, enabling black to play 3. Rook takes rook, check. 4. King takes rook, pawn from c6 takes rook, and again black has won a rook. The lesson, of course, is that if two of your pieces are threatened at once, try to do some damage with one of them. That is what white does in this variation by playing 3. Rook takes rook instead of the cowardly 3. Rook moves to f1. Assuming white sees all this, what will he do? He will reply to 1. Black queen moves to c6 with rook takes rook, permitting black to play queen takes queen. This way white gives up a queen for a rook, which isn't quite as bad as giving up a rook outright, though the game pretty well is over either way. White to move. What is the best move? Now vary the elements a bit more, yet see how they are functionally unchanged. It starts with the simple point that white has a capture in rook takes rook but that black's queen protects the rook. But rook takes rook also would be a check of black's king. This means white would have the priority of check on his side and so can take some risks that might otherwise lead to losses. He may be able to make 2 captures in a row. He therefore can afford to threaten black's queen with his own, and allow his queen to be captured, because then he will be able to take the rook, with check, and black's queen on successive moves. So he looks for a square from which he can attack black's queen with protection, and finds queen moves to g4, check. The move is a check, which matters. White has forked black's king and queen. Black must address the threat to his king, but if he merely moves it out of the way he loses his queen next move. He therefore plays queen takes queen. Now white takes his 2 moves, rook takes rook, check. And then, when the king moves to g7, pawn from f3 takes queen. White nets a rook. Black to move. What is the best move? What does black attack? White's rook, which is protected by its queen. The queen can't be captured, but maybe it can be attacked and thus driven or drawn away from its defense of the rook. The only piece black has available for the purpose is his own queen, so he lays his plans carefully. First he sees that queen moves to b6 would also check white's king. Again, that's important. It means white will be forced to play queen takes queen, rather than just moving his queen to a square like d5 where it is safe and still protects his rook. Second, Black sees that on b6 his queen would have protection from his bishop, protection necessary when attacking an enemy queen. The fact that the guard is a bishop also is significant, because it means that if white plays queen takes queen, black can recapture bishop takes queen with check and thus may again be able to take advantage of the priority of check. The sequence becomes clear: 1. Queen moves to b6, check. 2. Queen takes queen, bishop takes queen, check. 3. K moves, rook takes rook, and black has won a rook. The distinctive feature of this case, of course, is that the check was given not as a side effect of the capture rook takes rook, but rather as a side effect of taking white's queen. The principle still is the same. In this position as in the previous ones, after your opponent plays queen takes queen, you suddenly are confronted with two captures you would like to make, a recapture of his queen, and the original capture you were hoping to make after his queen moved. The priority of check teaches that when you have two possible captures and wish you could make both of them, you start with whichever one also gives check, if either does. This creates time for you to then play the other one. White to move. What is the best move? We are considering this position slightly out of its natural order, as it does not involve an attack on a queen that is guarding another piece. It nevertheless fits well here as a study in the priority of check and its uses. Start with what white threatens. His queen attacks black's queen, and his rook attacks black's knight, which defends black's queen. The natural thought would be rook takes knight, removing the queen's defender preparatory to playing queen takes queen a move later. The problem, of course, is that in reply to rook takes knight, black will be the one to play queen takes queen. Then if white recaptures with knight takes queen, black takes white's rook with bishop takes rook, and white has lost the exchange. The secret to turning around this result lies in the move order and in a clever use of the priority of check. Yes, white starts with rook takes knight, and black then plays queen takes queen, but now pause and observe white's position. He has two captures he can make, knight takes queen and rook takes rook e8+. He can have it both ways so long as he leaves black's queen alone for a moment and instead starts with rook takes rook e8+. This forces black to spend a move playing king takes rook, and now white plays knight takes queen. White's rook takes rook didn't win any material per se, it just traded rooks. But it enabled white to win a piece, because now his rook had taken out two enemy pieces before being captured rather than just one. And crucially, the rook took its second piece with check. If that were not so, black would reply to rook takes rook by retreating his queen. Lesson: there always is time for another capture if it's made with check. Go over this position until it sinks in. There are a couple of ways to misread it so that each of white's options appears to produce a wash. For example, you might look at it and see 1. Queen takes queen, knight takes queen, 2. Rook takes rook, king takes rook, and conclude that this achieves nothing. Then you imagine 1. Rook takes knight, queen takes queen, 2. Knight takes queen, rook takes rook, and see that this loses the exchange as described above. The breakthrough comes with persistence in playing with the move order and in looking for captures with check before reflexively grabbing at the most valuable enemy piece. White to move. What is the best move? Attacks on the queen to loosen a mating square. The queen makes an outstanding defender of its king's position. It can guard several squares at once, and can move in any direction if its services are required at the scene of an attack. It therefore is common enough to have the makings of what otherwise would be a good mating attack, only to find it frustrated by the enemy queen's presence nearby. In these circumstances, a simple attack on the queen may be enough to either drive it off or force your opponent to make a sacrifice to avoid disaster. This time we will separate conventional attacks on the queen from flush attacks, just for the sake of reinforcing each visual pattern independently. We begin with positions where you threaten the queen and really don't care if it takes your attacker. In fact, you hope it does. Our inspection of this first position turns up not only a pin of the rook on g7 but more generally an attack by white's rook and queen on the g7 square next to black's king, a mate threat. What prevents it from succeeding is black's queen on h7. The first urgent thing is not to let the presence of black's queen prevent you from wondering about what would be possible if it were gone. The next thought, then, is to consider throwing an attacker at the queen. In his rook on d3, white has a piece he can use for the purpose without disturbing his mate threat. He plays one. Our pawn from d3 moves to h3. Now black is in trouble. His queen is under attack and the rook aimed at it is loose, so the natural impulse is to play queen takes rook, but then white mates with queen takes rook. Yet the situation as it stands is untenable for black, because now his queen is pinned and thus cannot defend g7 anyway. This would have been another way to see the solution, of course. Trace the lines out from black's king and see a pinning opportunity on the h-file. So black has to play one. King moves to g8, freeing his queen. This avoids the mate, but now black still loses his queen to 2. Rook takes queen. Black is able to win back a rook by replying to, rook takes rook g1 plus, 3. Knight takes rook, king takes rook h7, still leaving white with a winning material advantage. In this case the attack on the guard of the mating square ends up winning it, one of several possible outcomes of such maneuvers, as we shall see. Now also notice another way to reach roughly the same result. You see that you have a capture to make in 1. Rook takes rook that leads to queen takes rook. You look for your next check, find 2. Rook moves to h3, and see that it forces black to play king moves to g8. Now you see black's king and queen again aligned on the same file, and this time white safely can run a pin through them with 3. Rook moves to g3, where the rook takes protection from the pawn on h2. After black plays queen takes rook, avoiding mate, white's 4. Pawn from h2 takes queen wins him a queen for a rook. Black to move. What is the best move? First examine what black attacks and how his pieces bear on white's king. Either way you are led to the same point, his queen and knight both attack the bishop on f2. The next point to see is that this almost creates a mating attack with queen takes bishop, all that prevents it is the protection furnished by white's queen on e2. When an otherwise good threat is frustrated by an enemy piece, focus on that piece and on how you might exploit the enemy's dependence on it. When the piece is a queen, one way to exploit the situation is by attacking it. The queen's value is so great that a simple threat against it may be enough to take the game. How can black attack the queen? With his bishop, via bishop moves to a6. In addition to attacking black's queen, this move pins it, preventing it from moving to another square on the second rank from which it still could defend the mating square f2. The pin ends the game by immobilizing the queen. If white plays queen takes bishop, black mates with queen takes bishop. If white plays anything other than queen takes bishop, black mates on f2 anyway a couple of moves later. If white moves his bishop from f2 to, say, d4, hoping to use it to defend f2, now black moves his rook up the f-file with rook takes bishop f3+, white is forced to bring his bishop back to f2 to offer a feudal interposition, and mate follows with queen takes at f2 a move later. It's a study in the pin, of course, as well as in the art of attacking the guard. White to move. What is the best move? This time the key to the mate threat is to examine black's king and its range of motion or lack thereof. It cannot move at all. A king so trapped is terribly vulnerable, so you should look for a check you can give that might snuff it out. White has 2 with his e5 knight. Knight moves to g6, check. Loses the knight to black's f7 pawn. The other, knight takes at f7, check. Is more interesting because all that prevents it from being mate is the protection provided to f7 by black's queen. We know that when a queen stops you from mating, its own freedom of action is limited and it becomes a potential target itself. How might you attack it? Ask about the availability of each of your pieces for the purpose, see that you can do it with your dark squared bishop. Bishop moves to d6. The bishop is loose there, but it doesn't matter. If black takes it, white mates. The only question is whether black can move his queen to a safe square from which it still can protect f7. He cannot. It would have to be another square on the 7th rank, and none are both safe and available. What black can play is queen moves to e7, after white plays bishop takes queen. This at least allows the recapture rook takes bishop, and now the rook is on the 7th rank, able to keep protecting f7. But the loss for black still is disastrous. White to move. What is the best move? It's generally best not to do anything until you have satisfied yourself that you understand the enemy king's position. Here as before, black's king is cramped stuck on the back rank, almost ready to be mated by white with rook takes rook. Seeing this is just a matter of examining whatever checks you have. In reply to that move, black wouldn't be able to move his king or interpose anything. The only defense that would remain is a capture of the threatening piece, here with queen takes rook. For this sort of case we have a mantra: when the only obstacle to mate is an enemy piece that would take your attacker, focus on the enemy piece. If it's a minor piece, it may be as good as pinned and unable to perform other defensive service. If the crucial enemy piece is the queen, as it is here, consider attacking it. In this case white has a few ways he might go after black's queen. Remember that black's goal in reply to any attack will be to move the queen to a square where it is safe and still protects f8. Thus, for example, in reply to one rook moves to c1, black can just play queen moves to d6 or, better still, queen takes rook c1 plus, winning the rook since the priority of check prevents white from taking advantage of the black queen's absence from c5. Much stronger for white, however, is 1. Queen moves to e5. Notice that this not only attacks black's queen but also attacks d6 and e7, two other squares the black queen might like to use. True, black still could play queen moves to b4 and protect f8 from there, but then notice another property of queen moves to e5, it creates an additional mating threat for white, aiming it at a square adjacent to black's king and already under attack by white's rook. So if black plays queen moves to b4 in reply to queen moves to e5, white plays queen takes at g7, checkmate. If black instead plays queen takes queen, white has rook takes rook, checkmate. Black does have a way to avoid mate, rook takes rook. But this forfeits his queen, and so illustrates one of our general principles in this section: an attack on an enemy queen that defends against mate sometimes wins the piece, because your opponent has to spend time taking other measures to prevent the immediate loss of the game. The difficulty in attacking the guard of a piece or square, as distinct from capturing it, is that an attack is not a forcing move in the same sense as a capture or check. A capture normally requires a recapture, which simplifies analysis. In reply to a mere threat against one of his pieces, though, your opponent generally has more options. He can add to the protection of the attacked piece, an often unsatisfactory course, however, when the attacked piece is a queen and slash or when it plays a defensive role that its replacement will not be able to fill. More to our point here, he can simply move the attacked piece, and there may be many squares to which it can flee. The beauty of attacking a queen that guards a mating square is that its options for flight are limited. It can only move if it stays within range of the square it is required to protect, and sometimes you can cut off some or all of those alternative squares with the same piece that launches the attack. Black to move. What is the best move? Ask what black attacks and how his pieces bear on white's king. His queen attacks white's rook, which is protected by white's queen. Does black have a mate threat? He does, as is obvious if you remember not to overlook your pawns. Black's h4 pawn attacks g3, and so does his queen, so black almost can mate with queen moves to g3. The only obstacle is the defense of g3 provided by white's queen from c7. Since the queen prevents mate, Attack it? The tool black has available for the purpose is his rook. It can attack the queen two ways, rook moves to c6 or rook moves to f7. Rook moves to c6 loses the rook to rook takes rook without budging the queen, but rook moves to f7 requires the queen to move. As we know, when the queen is attacked in these circumstances it usually tries to just move to another square where it will be safe and still able to defend the mating square. Here that would mean a move for white like queen moves to d6 or queen moves to b8. But this time the queen has something else to worry about, it also is guarding the rook on c3. So when white plays queen moves to d6, as he must to prevent mate, he loses his rook to queen takes rook. All this is well and good, but there is one more thing for black to consider, as often is the case, white has the option of responding to black's threat with a counter threat, thus when black plays 1, rook moves to f7, white can try to. Rook moves to c1, meeting the attack against his own queen with an attack against black's queen. The mistake for black then is to assume play would go to rook takes queen, 3. Rook takes queen. Instead, black should imagine the board after 2. Rook moves to c1 and ask what checks he would have. There would be a new possibility in 2. Rook takes at f3, check. Since it's a check, white would have no time to play rook takes queen. He would have to move his king to h2 or g2. Either way black replies 3. Queen moves to f2, check. And the net grows tight, indeed, the rest is forced, for king moves to h1, rook moves to h3, check. 5. Queen moves to h2, a formality, rook takes queen, checkmate. So the white counter-attack too. Rook moves to c1 is not something black has to worry about. So now back to a lesson of the main line of analysis. Here is another way in which attacking a queen may be fruitful, if it protects pieces or other points as well as a mating square, then if it moves it may leave its protectorate exposed. In a word, the queen in this case is overworked, and this time black takes advantage not by taking one of the queen's protectorates but by attacking the queen directly. As we see here and elsewhere, a threat of this sort against an overworked piece has an unusually high likelihood of creating real trouble for your opponent. The piece may be able to move and still protect one of the points it is supposed to defend, but probably not both of them.